أهلا وسهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. قبل 56 عاما كانت آخر مرة يقرر فيها رئيس أمريكا والديمقراطي أيضا عدم الترشح لفترة رئاسية ثانية. كان ذلك في عام 1968 في المؤتمر الوطني الديمقراطي المنعقد في شيكاغو. وقتها قامت الفوضى وانتشر العنف في الشوارع حول مركز المؤتمر. وفي هذا العام سيجتمع الحزب الديمقراطي مرة أخرى في شيكاغو، ثالث أكبر مدينة أميركية، وذلك بعد أسابيع قليلة من عزوف جو بايدن عن التنافس على فترة رئاسية ثانية في البيت الأبيض. فهل ستتم الفوضى من جديد؟ وهل سيعطل المحتجون مسار أعمال المؤتمر؟ أم ستظهر كامالا هاريس من شيكاغو كزعيمة لحزب مؤهد ومتحفز لهزيمة دونالد ترامب؟ لمناقشة ما يمكن أن نتوقعه من مؤتمر الحزب الديمقراطي، يسرني أن أستضيف ثلاثة من مراقبين متمارسين في السياسة الأمريكية: جاكوب رباشكين، أنجيلا جرايلين كين، وميني راكر. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. A month ago, Democrats were wailing that their geriatric presidential candidate had thrown in the towel with an abysmal debate performance. Today, everything has changed. Where are they? And what are the prospects for the new Democratic candidate? I'm delighted to welcome Anjela Greiling-Keene and Minnie Racker, and hopefully Jacob Rabashkin, to join us today to discuss the Democrats and their campaign for the White House. So, Angela, it took Kamala Harris less than 72 hours to lock up all the delegates. The Democratic Party is not known for being so orderly. What happened?
Indeed, there was some initial concern once President Biden announced he wasn't running for re-election that the party would be in its somewhat usual disarray in coalescing around a replacement candidate. However, the Democrats see this year's presidential election as a fight for their party, as a fight for democracy, as we've heard both President Biden and Vice President Harris say. And they also see this as a chance to gain an advantage they didn't previously have. So those factors are what led Kamala Harris to be able to lock up the requisite number of delegates very, very quickly and well ahead given the short notice of her campaign, but well ahead of the Democratic National Convention.
So, Jacob, in a nationally televised speech, President Biden explained that he was giving up the chance for a second term, not because he was too old, but because he wanted to unite his party. What was he really saying?
Well, what we've seen in the data over the last month, but really over the last 4 or 5 months, is that Biden has struggled to maintain the core elements of the Democratic coalition ahead of his 2024 re-election bid. Younger voters, Black voters, Hispanic and Latino voters, a lot of constituencies that have traditionally been the bedrock of Democratic support were showing that they were not on board with Biden in a significant way. And that was holding him back from being as strong a candidate against former President Trump as he could be. And I think there was a political recognition, clearly obvious to people who were paying attention, that Biden had lost support from enough of the base of his party and was struggling and probably unable to get it back, that he needed to step aside for another candidate in order to give Democrats at least a little bit of a clean slate heading into such a consequential race.
And Minnie, when you look at the sort of enthroning or the passing of the baton directly from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris without a contested primary, do you think that Kamala Harris is the candidate that is able to put back together, as it were, the coalition that Jacob was just describing that seemed to be fraying under Joe Biden?
Sorry. Yes, I think she is. I think most of the problems with Biden had to do with his age and his appearance and not necessarily his policies. I think Joe Biden commanded a lot of respect in his party, and there was just kind of an image issue that a lot of Democrats found tragic. So I think as soon as he endorsed Harris, people were pretty willing to jump on board with her because she solves those kind of personality problems for them. And you see that a wide variety of Democrats have come to back her already. We had squad members back her within hours. We had more centrist Democrats almost.
Squad being the most progressive part of the congressional Democratic caucus.
Correct. So her support really spans the Democrats as a whole, and she locked that down incredibly quickly.
And Angela, Joe Biden's testimonial for Kamala Harris, who herself was not a very successful presidential candidate when she ran her own race, is that enough for the party to go on?
Well, it certainly is enough for the party to nominate her as their candidate. It appeared pretty quickly that there will not be a contested convention for the Democrats in August, but is it enough to lock up the race? Of course not. Even though in the U.S. we consider this an abbreviated time for a candidate to be running, obviously a couple months like this is more time than many countries have for their elections. So keep that in mind. But there's a lot of time for Democrats to need to work to define her as a candidate. She's, of course, not as well known as Joe Biden just because she's not been around as long. Her profile as vice president has been somewhat low. So they need to define her. And they also really, really need to excite their base because a big part of whichever party wins this year will be getting out the vote. So they need to focus on the swing states and get all of the voters that are their potential constituencies to show up and actually cast their ballots.
And so, Jacob, help our viewers understand just the mechanics of switching at this late date from one candidate to another. Who makes the campaign decisions? Does Joe Biden's team just flip a switch and become Kamala Harris's team, or does an entire new team of professional political activists take over this campaign?
Well, these were all questions that I think a lot of people were asking themselves. And ultimately, the answer does appear to be that they did flip a switch and turn the Biden campaign into the Harris campaign. The fundamental apparatus of that operation, headquartered in Wilmington, Delaware, led by Jen O'Malley Dillon and Julie Chavez Rodriguez, went from being the Biden campaign to the Harris campaign. All of those pieces are still in place. The campaign funds that were sitting in the bank account for the Biden campaign are now sitting in an account with Harris's name on it. In fact, if you look at the ads, the advertisements that the campaign has been running on Facebook, on YouTube, on digital platforms, they even still say paid for by the Biden fund because it is the exact same operation. Now, I would anticipate that Harris will want to bring in at least one or two of her own people to serve at the very top to represent more clearly her own interests as opposed to the people that Joe Biden hired to run his campaign. But I think overall there's a recognition that the pieces that were in place around Joe Biden were not necessarily the problem. And for continuity's sake and for efficiency's sake, they will remain pretty central to the campaign moving forward.
Mini money is a fact of life in our political system. After the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, overnight, tens of millions of dollars poured into his campaign. What happened with the Kamala Harris campaign when Joe Biden announced that he was exiting the race?
The money was definitely one of the biggest upsides for Harris. We saw Harris have, I believe, the biggest grassroots fundraising day in history, raising $81 million in 24 hours. And that actually trickled down to all of the party's candidates. So the committee responsible for electing Democrats to Congress, to the House, and to the Senate, the committee responsible for electing down-ballot Democrats, they all had record grassroots fundraising as well. And what that means is online donations, small dollar donations, regular people who were really excited to see this change at the top of the ticket. So I think that's a real victory for Harris. We have a Kamala mania right now powering Democrats everywhere at a time when, Democrats were very worried that Joe Biden's candidacy was not only going to cause him to lose, but cause Democrats up and down the ticket to lose as well.
Kamala mania. All right, when we come back after the break, we'll talk about Chicago, setting for the Democratic National Convention before too long. In just a moment. Our guests again today include Minnie Rocker. Minnie is a politics reporter at the Daily Beast. She was previously a staff writer at Time magazine, where she covered the 2024 presidential primaries. And before that, she covered politics for the National Journal and the Los Angeles Times. Also with us is Angela Greiling-Keene. Angela is the news director at Bloomberg Government and the president of the Journalism and Women's Symposium. Previously, she reported for Politico and served as a past president of the National Press Club. And I'm delighted to have back Jacob Rabashkin. Jacob is reporter and analyst with Inside Elections, an online platform where he provides analysis of political campaigns from the State House to the White House. Previously, Jacob worked at NBC News in Washington and for CNN's political unit. Okay, let's turn to Chicago, Angela. Chicago, famously the setting of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, the last time a sitting president decided not to seek a second term. It didn't go so well for the Democrats in 68, both in Chicago and in the election that soon followed. What are we supposed to expect at this year's Chicago convention?
There were already a lot of parallels with 1968, even before President Biden announced he wasn't going to run for re-election. Obviously, we have two wars going on around the world, and there's been a lot of unrest associated with especially, obviously, the war in Gaza. So protests were already anticipated. Security was already going to be high at the convention in Chicago because of that. And then add in the change in candidate, add in the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and things are really even more heightened. So the comparisons to 1968 will be rife during the convention and in the weeks leading up to it. Obviously, the change in candidate, like you mentioned, in 1968, we saw the Republicans take the White House at a time that was extremely chaotic, and they held it for 2 terms. A little more than that if you count the non-elected President Ford, but that's getting into details. So who knows if that will be a parallel with 1968? There's no way to predict that future right now, but the actual convention and the potential chaos to literally surround it is something that the Democrats are very cognizant of. Obviously, as we saw at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, the security was tight. It will definitely be tight in Chicago. The perimeters will be big. They want to make sure that all of the disruptions are outside of the actual convention, and that is something that is absolutely front of mind for the Democratic National Convention organizers as they're leading up at this point.
I mean, Jacob, Milwaukee is a village compared to Chicago, which is America's third largest city and a world metropolis. Protests dominated in '68. We saw just recently when the Prime Minister of Israel spoke in Washington at Congress, very substantial protests that with some ugly scenes of the burning of the American flag, right outside the congressional perimeter. Are we likely to see some of these sorts of things in Chicago as well?
There's certainly a potential for things to get out of hand in Chicago. As you said, it's a major American city. People don't have to travel there if they want to go demonstrate in the same way that people probably had to travel to Milwaukee to do so for the Republican convention. It's a city with a lot of history of social activism, both attached to those past conventions. And I do believe it's held more conventions than any other city. Perhaps Baltimore has had more, but on the Democratic side, at least. But there's certainly the ingredients there for some disruption, absolutely. However, right, as Angela said, the perimeter is going to be substantial. I'll tell you, we were in Milwaukee, and you had to walk probably half an hour to get to a place where protesters could even show up. From the Pfizer arena where the actual convention was taking place. So I would imagine the perimeter will be quite expansive. The party will be doing whatever they can to minimize the spectacle of disruption. And frankly, without Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, I think a lot of the wind will be taken out of the sails of some of the people who were really agitating for a different nominee. I think Harris ultimately does not inspire the same kind of anger and frustration among some corners of the country and certainly among Democratic adjacent groups that Joe Biden did. And that may be a benefit to her as she looks to make this a more smooth process in August.
So, Minnie, when we look to the convention, inside the convention hall, at least three major speeches: Joe Biden's valedictory, Kamala Harris's coronation, and the introduction of her vice president and his acceptance speech. Are there other special events that we should expect? We had Hulk Hogan for the Republicans. Is there going to be a comparable Democratic alternative to the Hulk?
Well, I don't think we know all the specifics yet, but I do think we're seeing a huge amount of momentum, as I said, momentum behind Harris. We're seeing especially like women donors, prominent Black leaders, prominent South Asian leaders, really excited about the Harris candidacy. We're seeing celebrities, young people, musicians. She's using a Beyonce song in her launch video. I think you're going to see some big name celebrities speaking as well. That's just my prediction, but I think a lot of people are really excited to get on board with this kind of historic candidacy, particularly people who haven't had their voices heard that often in politics before. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch and see kind of the biggest names that show up.
Angela, we haven't mentioned what up until recently was the biggest name in Democratic Party politics. That's Barack Obama. There seems to be some displeasure among Biden people that perhaps Barack Obama too eagerly, even perhaps aggressively, pushed for Biden to leave the ticket. Do we expect Barack Obama to play a prominent role in Chicago?
Like Minnie, I don't actually know that they have not released the schedule yet, but the Obama question is definitely on people's minds. Remember that Barack Obama is from Chicago and he lives there part-time. So it would be very logical for him to show up in his home city that is hosting the convention. It also would be probably a bit strange if he didn't show up. I covered the Democratic National Convention in 2016 and Bill Clinton was there. So there's certainly a tradition of former presidents showing up to support people who could succeed them in office. And I think that if Obama were not there, it would be a conspicuous absence. That being said, he, of course, was the first Black U.S. president. Were Kamala Harris to be elected, she would be the second. And he wants to keep the spotlight on her, but he also wants to do what he can to support her. You'll recall Obama held his iconic victory party in Grant Park. That's not too far. It's about a mile and a half away from the United Center where this convention is being held. So there's potential for, some imagery that could really rally the party's base as well if President Obama gets involved.
All right, Jacob, let's take a look at the Harris campaign itself. Joe Biden's central theme was a battle for the soul of America, the fight to save American democracy in the face of of a potential Trump presidency that might derail the Democratic experiment. Do we expect Kamala Harris to sustain that theme, or are we going to hear a different theme from the Harris campaign?
Well, the theme we've begun to hear already, as many said, Freedom by Beyonce being the walkout music for Harris at her public events so far, the soundtrack to her launch video. And I think freedom seems to be taking the place of democracy as the buzzword of the campaign, at least in its early days, focusing on freedom, personal freedom, the tie-in to abortion rights, of course, which is the issue that Harris has been most outspoken about as vice president since the Dobbs decision, all of those really coming to the fore. I think a couple of other themes that we're seeing begun to be fleshed out, even though it's early days, are the contrast between what she likes to say, the prosecutor and the perpetrator. She is, of course, a former prosecutor. Trump is a convicted felon, and she has leaned into that contrast as a way of both highlighting her own bona fides and Trump's baggage. So that's absolutely something that we're going to be watching. And then the most organic moment, I would argue, from her first rally in Milwaukee, she made a comment about how we're not going back to the Trump era. And the arena erupted, started chanting, "We're not going back, we're not going back." And you could see in real time Harris pick up on this as a particularly salient theme that really resonated organically with voters. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that line, "We're not going back," implemented a little bit more front and center in the messaging moving forward as well.
And then we're likely to see a debate at some point. Donald Trump, after some speculation he wouldn't want one, said, bring it on. Minnie, the Democrats didn't do too well in the last Democratic-Republican presidential debate. Is Kamala Harris looking forward to debating Donald Trump, or is this a hazard for her to be worried about?
I think Harris is looking forward to it. I think some of her momentum has to do with the fact that she's just such a strong contrast to Biden, because Biden's performance was so bad, and Kamala Harris is a prosecutor and has made a point that Trump is a convicted felon and she's ready to prosecute him. So I think it'll be good for her on the whole. At the same time, I do want to note she has a reputation of being a little overly cautious, of issuing some word salad. So there's also an opportunity for her to mess up. It'll be a high pressure moment and definitely one to watch.
All right, we're going to have to end here. Lots to talk about in the emerging Harris-Trump campaign. Look forward to discussing this in the weeks ahead with you, Minnie Racker, Jacob Rabashkin, and Angela Greiling-Keene. Thank you for joining me this week on Dachel, Washington.
Are we going to continue with the success that we've had under one president, or are we going to put the brakes on and turn into Venezuela or some other country that doesn't look like this one?
I appreciate that there are people who are looking into ethics and finding injustices and correcting them, and I find it a little distressing that some would be so adamant to try to prevent that from happening. And I think it's reflective of a larger issue that's going on in the country right now, of divided politics and opinions and things, and not enough people getting together and actually talking about things and coming to what I used to say, and learning from management, was getting to yes.
The government is very broken. That's all I really have to say. That's the major issue here, as far as I'm concerned.
وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات عن هذه الحلقة، خاصة حول دور كامالا هاريس كزعيمة للحزب الديمقراطي، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.